Hi, gang. This is our first look at the topic of special senses. So, we've looked at the nervous system and we've talked about some of the general senses, but today we're going to get into the special senses, which are usually a pretty fun topic. So, topic one is what is sensation and perception, and what are some of the special senses? So, sensation occurs when the threshold stimulus is received by a sensory neuron. So, what that means is there are stimuli all around us in the environment all the time. We are not necessarily noticing every single thing that is happening every single moment of the day because your brain would get overloaded. So, there has to be a certain threshold, a certain volume of sound, or a certain percentage of odor molecules in the environment before your sensory neurons begin to fire. When that threshold is reached, then an action potential is sent to the appropriate region of the brain. When that action potential reaches the region of the brain that's responsible for interpreting that information, then a perception is created. That perception might be, oh, there's an airplane overhead, or oh, that smells like chocolate chip cookies. So that's the perception that is created. It doesn't mean it's what is actually happening in the environment, but it's the way your brain interprets it. So the brain is constantly making its best guess of what the information it's receiving might mean for you. Sometimes the brain is wrong. Oftentimes the brain is wrong. And it uses a process called projection to determine where the information is coming from and what its importance is. So it's pretty easy if we're dealing with, say, a sound on the right side of your head. That sound information is received by the receptor and then it travels directly to the brain for processing. And that's a pretty direct route. So the projection of that information is generally pretty accurate. If the information comes from farther away, or it comes from a region where there are lots of receptors for different kinds of things, like, say, pain, pressure, temperature, for example, then the brain has to do a lot more guesswork in order to make any determinations. And so that can cause a lot of inaccuracy at times. We've also discussed this process of sensory adaptation earlier on in the semester, or pardon me, in the year, when we were looking at, say, the temperature in that water bath. When you had to be in the ice cold water, your body eventually got used to it. So remember that sensory adaptation is a mechanism that the brain uses to reduce the perception of some kinds of information. If we are being exposed to that information continuously, eventually the brain stops responding to it. It stops telling you, oh, you're in a cold pool, or oh, your socks are touching your ankles, because those things just aren't critical for the brain to really be on top of it at all times. Here is just a little bit of a reminder of some of the kinds of receptors that we've talked about this year. So we have spent quite a bit of time on everything except for chemoreceptors. We talked about pain receptors, which in anatomical language are called nociceptors. We've talked about thermoreceptors, both hot and cold. We've talked about mechanoreceptors, so those are ones for the sensations of touch, pressure, even vibrational information, which we haven't talked that much about yet, but we will. And today we're going to be looking at chemoreceptors for the first time, so that is a new one for us. In terms of nociceptors, there are often times in the body where there are stimuli that are being received, and then that information goes to the brain, and they're coming from regions that have a lot of action. So, for example, the chest and stomach being a very broad word here. Mostly I mean the abdominal region. There are many organs, dozens, sometimes hundreds of different large and small blood vessels. There are there's muscles, there's fat, there's skin, there's all kinds of structures happening in these areas. And so when there's pain in one of those structures, that pain impulse goes to the brain, but it's really difficult for the brain to make determinations about the exact location of where that came from. If you have ever been to the doctor with any kind of stomach pain, for example, the doctor will ask you lots of questions. Is it sharp or is it dull? Is it stabbing or is it achy? Is it continuous or does it come and go? Does it change when you move positions or is it there no matter what? All of those things help your doctor to make decisions about whether this is a critical situation or if this is a nerve pull, or pardon me, a muscle pull, for example. The brain has to do this too, and when the brain is trying to make its best guess, it goes through this process in which we experience what's called referred pain. So what that means is the brain gets the information there is a problem in, say, the lower left quadrant of the abdominal cavity. Well, the lower left quadrant has small intestine, it has large intestine. Depending on whether it's in the front or the back, it could be kidney pain. If you're female, it might be ovarian or uterine pain. It could be muscle. We've got transversus abdominis, we've got the internal and external obliques in that region. So there are lots of things it could be. And so the brain has to make some guesses, and a lot of times it makes it difficult for you to determine exactly what hurts and why. So here are some examples of those pathways. You can see if you look at this, the anterior facing person on the left side where that you see this kind of dark maroon color. When someone has actual pain stimuli occurring in the heart, it can feel to the brain like any part of this upper chest region, as well as down the back and inside of the left arm, all the way into the pinky, and in the middle of the spine on the back side. So the brain can interpret, say, for example, a heart attack as left tricep pain. It's not always right. And there's a lot of challenges that come with the processing of sensory information. So now we get to the special senses. You have basically 6 major special senses. Most people would say 5: sight, sound, taste, touch, and then feel. There is another one that we'll talk about in the next lecture. But I've kind of broken down the ones that you generally are familiar with. So we've got vision, and the special receptors that are responsible for the detection of light information are called photoreceptors. Photo is the Greek word for light. The cochlea, I'll know that you're not listening to these notes if you come into class and call this the cochlea. The cochlea detects sound. It is a tiny little structure in the inner ear that we'll talk more about in the next lecture, but it does that using mechanoreceptors. Both taste and smell, located on the tongue and in the nose, use chemoreceptors. So chemo means chemicals. And then there's another tiny structure in the inner ear that helps your body to detect motion, both when your body is in motion and the motion of your body as it shifts position. And those canals use mechanoreceptors as well. So our first special sense that we are going to investigate in a laboratory is the sense of smell. So the scientific word for the sense of smell is olfaction. So olfactory receptors are those that detect odors. These are specialized chemoreceptors that are found in the roof of the nose, and they are located in a special set of kind of skin cells that are called the olfactory bulb. You saw this in the sheep brains. The sheep have much larger olfactory bulbs than we do, but we have a very similar structure. It's at the top of our nasal cavity and on the underside of the brain. So in order for the olfactory receptors to detect these chemicals, the chemicals must be in a gas form. So they must be able to vaporize. Those of you who took chemistry last year or the year before should remember this from that unit. So once they evaporate into the air, then when we breathe in, They come in with the air that we breathe, and they get trapped in the watery mucus that is in all openings of your body: mouth, nose, ears, other places. So those chemicals dissolve into the mucus, and then they reach the little receptors that are lining small hairs in the nose called cilia. There are small hairs in all openings of the body also. If the shape of the chemical matches a receptor that exists in your nasal cavity, then just like a lock and a key, that receptor will start firing action potentials to the brain to allow for the brain to interpret that information. The receptors send the information along the olfactory bulb. The olfactory bulb is like a highway of nerves, and they travel directly to the olfactory cortex, which is a region right where the frontal and temporal lobe meet. That's where the brain interprets the information and then tells you whether you're smelling seventh grade boy or chocolate chip cookie. Here's what that looks like. So our olfactory receptors are in the roof of the nasal cavity. They look like little upside down trees here. The odor chemicals, which we see in little blue dots, get breathed in. They dissolve in the mucus. If they match a receptor, then that starts the receptor firing. Those impulses travel along the olfactory bulb and eventually end up at the olfactory cortex, right at the back of the frontal lobe and right at the front of the temporal lobe, which is missing in this picture because we're looking at this side of the brain. You can see how close it is to the diencephalon, which is where emotion and memories are being processed. You are not nearly as fancy as a sheep in terms of smell, but you are pretty fancy. You can smell about 10,000 different and distinct odors. So smell is super important for our second special sense, which is taste. The anatomical word for taste is gustation, which is not appealing, but that's what it is. And so much like the receptors in the nose, we have tiny receptors all along the surface of the tongue. We don't have cilia in the mouth. There aren't little hairs. There are rather little bumps called papilla, which is the very generic word for bumps. You know, dermal papilla is the little ridges in your fingerprints. So the papilla are your taste buds. There are about 10,000 of them, give or take, on everyone's tongue. And there are about another 1,000 of them on the roof of the mouth. Within each little taste bud, there are hundreds of receptors. And when those receptors come into contact with a chemical that matches their shape, then we get a taste sensation. Humans are only able to taste 5 specific sensations: sweet, like sugar; sour, like a lemon; salty, like salt; bitter, like tea or coffee; and umami, which is the Japanese word for savory. So think of like earthy flavors like mushroom, meat, cheeses, things like that. Just like the nasal cavity, the chemicals have to dissolve into the saliva of the mouth. So these are either liquid or solid forms of chemicals. They don't have to be in a gas form here. When they dissolve into the saliva, if they match the shape, then an action potential is sent. And once again, taste can be processed. Here's a little picture of your tongue. There are different shaped taste buds. And everybody has a little bit of a different taste bud map. Your sense of taste is unique from everyone else's, and we are going to explore this map in the lab very shortly. So again, here are your 5 basic tastes, and you can kind of see here why those are the ones that are important to humans, why we have those specific detections. Because we only have the 5 flavors that we can taste, odor is a really, really, really important part of our food experience. The 10,000 odors that we can smell lead to the different flavor sensations that we have. There are only 5 taste receptors on your tongue, but when your brain processes both the smell of the food and the taste of the food together, you get a broader flavor experience. So rather than just an experience of sweet, if you were to, say, drink a milkshake, you can actually taste the milkshake as vanilla or chocolate or banana or whatever else. And that's all because of the experience of smell that is coming from that milkshake. If your smell is impacted, like for example, when you have a cold and the mucus in your nasal cavity is extra thick and extra runny and kind of extra present, then it's really hard for the chemicals to get all the way through that mucus to the receptors, which is why your taste is so impacted when you're sick. It's also important to recognize that spicy is not a flavor. Spicy is not a taste sensation, but it is a pain sensation. So there are pain receptors in every taste bud. And when those pain receptors are triggered by a spicy salsa, for example, your brain interprets that as spicy. So here are your summary questions for this set of notes. We will have some time in class to go over them as well, and time for you to chat with your partners. If you would like it, I will see you soon.